Not only must the law be used lawfully, but I want to make another point, that the law must be used. Churches have gone far astray by not preaching on the law of God. They love the love of God. They love the peace of God. They can even squeeze in there the fruit of the Spirit because it's less constraining. They love unity, and they fail to preach the law of God. And what is it frequently that I hear, that I even read in a commentary from somebody this week? We ought not call things to the world what the law of God calls them, because in our day, that's seen as so offensive, even homophobic, etc. So we find other ways to put it, and we point them to Jesus. God's told us how to point people to Jesus, and it's His law. Preach the law. You don't get to edit God. Why? We need to say this every week. We must not edit God. He's the Lord. We are not. So in other words, the church needs to call things sin that the Bible calls sin, and we need to threaten the judgment that God says is due for that judgment. And I'm saying that to the world out there, and it goes on the internet, and it goes out there, and you post your scriptures, and it goes out there, but it also needs to be said in here, but it must do both. It must be said to the world, said to... The two parts of this is that the law identifies and threatens sin. So our world is sort of, they think they're moral people, they're pretty good, and then you hear some preacher say that having 3 girlfriends plus a wife and abusing your kids is unholy and unrighteous, and thou shalt not, and you go to hell for that. And you go, who's this punk? Who says that? They're being identified for their sin. The state says we love and every life matters, and if it saves one life, and we're also going to bring in some laws that allow for abortion up to birth. And they hear preachers say, that's murderous, God will curse you, you have blood on your hand, the most innocent kind of blood, innocent infant blood on your hands, O Premier. They hear the testimony of the church, and they are meant to have their conscience struck. That is part of the job of the church. We must do that. We must preach. And so we'll just look at verse 9 through 10, where Paul does that. He doesn't just say the law generally, right? This is where you've got to get into specifics. Lots of pastors, they'll mention the law in general. Okay, read it. Read it specifically, read it slowly, and even explain its application. That's what Paul does. He basically goes through the 10 commandments here in a veiled way. He basically goes through from the first 4 commandments about worshipping God, and then the last 5 are a lot clearer, but we'll see it. And he sort of says all of these extreme ways to break the 10 commandments. Look at what he says. Verse 9. Understand this, the law was not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and the disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners. Ungodly, the first and second commandment. For the unholy and profane, the third and fourth, of not blaspheming God and not profaning His holy day. The unholy, the profane. For those who strike their fathers and mothers, breaking the 5th commandment. For murderers, breaking the 6th commandment. The sexually immoral. Men who practice homosexuality, breaking the 7th commandment. Do you see what happens when you get specific with God's law? You're forced to say specific things that are very well accepted in the day. And so God demands the church, I've given you the law, preach the law, use the law, do it lawfully, but do not neglect the law. Consciences need to be awakened. The world needs to be shaken to realize their sin has consequences and their life is sinful. Going on, he says enslavers. This is actually an application of the 8th commandment of stealing. This is the worst kind of stealing human beings and enslaving them. Perjurers and liars, this is the 9th commandment of do not lie, especially in court and under oath. And whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. He doesn't mention a sin about covetousness because that's less outward, and he's mentioning very outward kind of sins, but he does include it when he says, and literally everything else that sound doctrine doesn't produce and that disagrees with sound doctrine, which is in accordance with the gospel. So the law must be used, it must be preached, and it must be preached specifically because the church is the pillar and buttress of the truth.